this is basically the number one design issue with respect to with internationalization.
All your UIs are fucked.
Yeah, you have to, if you're not planning from the very beginning to handle, because basically, as the thing, you got your character width and like the square characters versus not, but you've also got German.
Oh my God. German.
What the fuck is going on over there?
Butterscotch.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 454 of Coffee with Butterscotch, the game dev comedy podcast of Butterscotch Shenanigans. I'm Seth and I'm the games programmer.
I'm Adam and I'm the webs programmer.
I'm Sam and I'm the artiste.
And this is a show where we talk about life, business, and working in the games industry. Today is February 9th, 22x4. Before we get started, we have a warning. There's going to be profanity in this show. We'd also like to thank our recurring supporters over at moneygrab.bscotch.net. Thank you so much for your monthly donations to help keep the pod juices flowing. All right, so today we are going to we're going to really just talk about localization. I don't know if we'll even have time to get some questions because man, we can bloviate about localization a lot.
Yeah.
Because it's a big problem. So first, let's probably step back. What even is it? Because that's a term that probably not everybody
and
is
there's a
familiar
handful
with.
of related terms. Yeah. So this is part of our sort of recurring theme that making games is the easy part and it's all the rest that's actually really hard, you know?
Yeah.
And so
as in like you can make a game in a weekend and have it be fun and playable and even polished and really nice, right?
Having it be production ready, work on all platforms, be tested, be localized, be et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the list goes on and on. All that stuff is
that's the hard part.
That's a lot. So localization. So we got internationalization, localization, and translation. Those are the three kind of core ideas that are related but not the same. So I'm just going to define them real quick.
Define terms.
Internationalization is the process by which you prepare your game to be translated, basically, right? So that means like pulling all the strings meaning the text, right? Pulling all the strings out so that translators have access to them, describing them, setting up things so that numbers would get formatted differently depending on the language choice and all this kind of stuff, right? So when you first like make a game, if you're not paying attention to any of this stuff, what you're going to end up with is everything is just kind of baked in for your native language, right? And then when you go to be like, okay, now it's time to localize this thing, you're going to need to go through that internationalization step where you basically
But what's the localization part?
So that's now the internationalization. Then we got localization and translation, which are highly overlapping concepts, right? So translation is just the like, I got something in this language, I want it in this other language, and you just convert
verbatim, try to convert. Yeah.
So localization is the same idea but fancier, where you're basically taking into account all the stuff that goes into like differences between cultures and formats and all this kind of stuff, right? So
maybe colloquialisms, like jokes, memes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cause like the memes that we have and the kinds of jokes we have and stuff, in the US even may not be the same ones that are in the UK, even though we both speak English.
Yeah.
Right. And so if we're localizing our game for a certain region of the world, we have to make sure like the jokes have to land, the stories have to make sense, the characters have to speak in a way that works, Because
oftentimes,
and this is why
if you do a direct translation, right? Like a direct translation of something, a lot of the times you end up with a lot of essentially chaos factors because a lot of idioms, a lot of jokes, whatever else, they don't make any fucking sense outside of your cultural context, like any sense, right?
And so oftentimes they barely even make sense in the cultural context they started in.
Yeah, they require a shared understanding of the world.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can think of like localization as translation with full context is basically what it is, right?
Yes.
But localization and translation as words are kind of used basically interchangeably. Just know that they don't mean exactly the same thing. And you'll see when you're getting into like getting professional translation done of a game, you're going to be talking to localization teams, right? So you as a developer, mostly what you're doing is like the internationalization. You're preparing to make it possible to do localization, and then you're going to hand over all the stuff. You're going to hand over all the strings, all the documentation, all the context, your game itself, whatever it is that the localization team is going to need, and you hand that over to into like localizers, and they do it.
Yeah, before we get into all the like the how this goes about, it's good to back up and ask a question like, why would you bother? Why even bother, right? Because this is a very different process than localizing other kinds of content. So whether that's like a book or a TV show or something like that, where it is possible for a person translating said thing to actually essentially experience the full context of that thing. Like there's nothing about a book that is happening sort of randomly to a person in different contexts. Like if you read it in a cafe, page 6 turns into a fucking origami crane that you have to fold to get to page 7. Like that doesn't happen.
It's a fully encapsulated experience that each person will experience sequentially, and they will experience the whole thing in a pretty constrained time frame.
Yes.
It's only in text. And like, if you read a book, maybe it'll take you 6 hours or something like that to read the book. Somebody else might take 7 hours, 8 hours, whatever. People read at different speeds, but you're still reading the same words in the same order, and you're getting the exact same story.
Yes. And the same thing works for TV shows for us, where also if you think about the role of a translator in those contexts, they are able to see the entirety of what the audience is going to see at that moment in time, right?
Yeah.
And
they don't have to have any skill. They don't have to have any special hardware,
Well,
like
they do need to have a lot of skill because translation.
Well, sorry, I mean like fast Twitch skill, like gaming skills, or whatever, right? Like they have to be good at translating, but they don't have to be things to like read a book. You know what I mean?
Right. So there's a difference here then in basically experientially how games unroll versus other kinds of media that are more serial in time, right? Where you experience it as a time flow. And so that basically sets the scene then for a lot of this tech development that's required in order to be able to do a good translation for a game, a good localization for a game. Yeah. So again, the question is like, why?
Yeah. If you think about that in terms of like Crashlands 2, right? So a book, fully learning experience versus Crashlands 2. The question at hand is basically in the game of Crashlands, we have, let's say, a creature that you could hit with a certain weapon, right? That's made out of its parts, right? And you've got quests that mention that creature, right? And some other thing that unlocks that creature, and some other thing where two characters are talking about it or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. What order do you put those in so that the translators know what the hell is happening, right?
Yeah. Because again, you can't require that they play the game in order to translate it. It's not like, and it's also not like a book where, games typically are one-way valves, right? Where if you finish this quest, you don't just flip the page backward to go check it out again.
Yeah, you lose access to content.
You lose access. So you have to develop all these dev tools and stuff. So again, like when you back up and you ask a question like, why would you care that? Because this is horrendously complicated.
Yeah.
And on a per game basis, it's horrendously complicated. There's no easy solution. So why?
Yeah, there's one obvious easy answer that's not even about like the business case. But if you do make a game and sell it and it's reasonably popular, you will now be, for the rest of time, bombarded at random by people who don't speak the language that you made that game in, asking you to localize it into their language, right? Mm-hmm. So at base, like that's the reason, right? Is because people want to be able to actually experience your game, and they can't if it's in a language that they don't know, right?
And they'll tell you about it.
And also they'll tell you. So you'll be constantly aware that you've kind of left players out. Right.
Which like it's a perpetual bummer that, the original Crashlands is only in 2 languages, English and Chinese. It took, I think, 8 months to get the game localized into Chinese. The
game took 2 years to make. So
it was not set up. It was not set up for internationalization like Adam was talking about. So we hadn't like made a game that we could conceive of being popular or accessible outside of even like the US in our early days. And so the idea of localization was just not on our radar at that time. And also we just didn't have the resources to think about it. It's an
infrastructure problem. Typically.
Like we legit had like $500 in our bank account when we launched Crashlands. Yep. There's no, like we could not have localized it. It costs typically about like 10 to 15 cents, I guess, per word.
Yeah,
per language, right? Yep. And so Crashlands had 60 or 70,000 words in it. Do the math. It's not $500. I'll tell you that.
So, but I think when you back it up, it's also the fact that if you have a game that does do well, you have a lot of people who play it in English who, of course, like would want to share it with their friends, whatever else. There's a broader audience basically available for it. But then 2 is from a direct business case thing, which is if you're a developer and you're wanting to do a deal, right? We've talked a lot about the deals, right? On Game Pass, Netflix, Apple Arcade, whatever. Many of those deals nowadays require some number of languages.
With those big partners,
With the big partners.
Because they support, all of their stuff, they want to be as international as possible because they're trying to make money
think
everywhere.
about it. If you're Apple Arcade or something like that and you actually have literally millions of players across the globe, and you want them to all be able to opt into this, subscription service for your games, it would be crazy to not essentially put languages as one of the things that you're trying to make sure all the devs do, so that you have the reach that you need in order to support.
It would be hard to sell your service at the same price in some other locale where only a third of the games are actually playable in that language, right?
Well, and importantly, it's a curated platform. They only have so many games on there, right? And so if you're coming in with your really high quality game that is only in English, and somebody else comes in with a equally high quality game that is in every language, which one are they gonna give the slot?
Well, and it's also part of the whole, like, we talk about the importance of cross-platform development and stuff. It's the same idea, right? It's the more markets you can participate in, the more likely you're able to recoup all of your costs and actually stay afloat.
Yeah, well, and because of cultural differences, like sometimes you'll see certain types of game or genre of game are more appealing to people in certain countries or cultures, and also just randomly, yes. Like your game may end up like actually not doing very well in your native country, and then it goes gangbusters halfway across the world.
Crashlands, original Crashlands is a good example of this, where Crashlands did fine, like in the U.S., right? It did great in the U.S. But once we localized it, actually, before we even localized it into Chinese, into Mandarin Chinese on purpose, it had already been pirated, cracked, and translated by some randos, right, in China, and which we discovered like a while later. But then once we had some analytics in the game, we discovered that a fucking enormous number of people were playing that cracked,
millions,
basically fan localized version of the game, right? More than we actually had playing the English version.
It's typical for pirates, frankly. But.
There's always, when we talk about piracy, it's always a bigger number to it. But so once we did localize, so at this point now, here, 8 years later or something, right? If you look at our on Steam, if you look at our breakdown of where people are buying original Crashlands, it's now majority from China, right? So, and that was like not what we expected. We did support for simplified Chinese because we were working with WeGame to get Crashlands onto their platform in China at the time, right? We weren't really thinking that like, oh yeah, this is also going to be a
good for our Steam sales.
Market. Yeah, exactly. And that turned out to be, and that was that lesson too of a lot of this is you just don't know where your audience is going.
Yeah, you don't know where it's going to show up.
Yeah, so it's part of like, it's really expensive to do cross-platform development. It's really expensive to do multi-language support, right? Like all these things are really expensive, but anytime something that's expensive gives you access to a new market, it's a reasonably good dice roll, But it's
especially because, and then the kind of the final point for me is that like, okay, so you got your broader audience thing, or just the fact that if you make a game that people like, you're going to get bombarded, right? Okay, so having an answer for that's good. 2 is of course business deals. Nowadays, the big ones require it. Oftentimes, so you need to be prepared. And then 3 is just kind of to this point, algorithmically on something like fucking Steam or whatever Play Store, whatever else you're on. While it's true that localized language is going to be a smaller percent, or like a particularly small percent of your audience potentially. So if you're like in, I don't know, if you do like Polish or something like that, it's not like the vast majority of Steam players are Polish, right?
Yeah, it's actually still a tiny fraction, right?
It's still a tiny fraction, but there's these little multiplier effects where a lot of the velocity stuff with these algorithms is just about getting over certain thresholds, certain humps before it really starts like kicking you into gear, right? So it's not necessarily the case that you need every language to somehow perform, essentially like English or Chinese can in terms of just the sheer audience size. But rather any one of these languages giving you a couple of these, there's like these little edges, these little bumps up, in terms of velocity, in terms of how many people are wishlisting the game, whatever, can then essentially flip. It's a tipping point problem, right? You want to get over certain thresholds where now Steam recognizes that the game is more popular than some other games, or you kind of get out of the basement bin with some of these things with regards to like just how many wishlists there are, how many sales, etc. And so it's that huge wombo combo of like, yeah, it's all the things. And then you have the problem of like, okay, so if it's kind of required in a business sense nowadays because of subscription model stuff, and it can give you the boost that you need to like not fade into obscurity from a discovery standpoint, how do you
do it? All right, so let's talk about. All right, so there's kind of like three pieces to this that we hopefully can talk about this episode. So the first one is just what does it mean to internationalize your game? So how do you think about setting up your game so that it's easy to translate text, to localize? The second thing is then just the actual process of localizing it. So what do the translators need and how do they go about their job? And then the last bit is getting the translations back into the game, right? So it's a loop. You got to get the text out of the game, get it to the translators, give them what they need, get stuff back from them, put it back in the game, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
and then of course, changes management across that system. Yeah. Right.
That's the thing you'll learn about doing any kind of like real production development work like this is everything is about change management at the end. It's handoffs and change management.
Yeah.
Just
so since I spend a lot of time on the internationalization side of things, which is setting up the game and programming it so they can accommodate multiple languages. I'll talk about that, that part, which is, so I think about it as kind of like three primary problem domains. Okay. So the first two are pretty obvious if you think about them, but if you haven't thought about them, you'll run into problems. First one is fonts.
Yeah.
Not every font supports every character.
In fact, most fonts support very few languages.
Yeah. And so you may have chosen a font for your game that like as you're making it in English doesn't actually have that many characters, really, right? And so all the text in your game looks great. It's formatted great. It fits well in all the interfaces and all that stuff.
With your painstakingly chosen font that you spent, hours and hours getting exactly the right font.
Yeah, because it's just great. Stylistically, it's just the one that your game needs.
Yeah,
right?
And all of your designs are now like focused on that font. It's like the centerpiece, like it's all baked into your whole design plan.
So then you translate into Polish. And you get it back, and there's just a bunch of weird squares all over your interface because it turns out your font doesn't have those characters, and it can't render them, and they just go to some default like placeholder glyph.
Whoops, which is a rectangle. Also called, is it called tofu?
Called tofu, yeah. It's one of the colloquialisms.
So that's a big consideration. Make sure that you have a couple options. One is you can choose new fonts for other languages and just have the font swap. That takes a little bit more work, right? Because then you got to find a bunch of fonts instead of just like one that has a shitload of characters in it. But it's generally going to be the case that for what you call like the CJK languages, the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, which isn't like there's also like sub like variations of those languages, but they share a lot of characters and stuff. And so you'll typically have at least two fonts where one is for your CJK languages and the other is for your non-CJK languages.
Yeah. And then if you're also supporting some other stuff like Turkish and these kinds of things, right, then you may also have different ones for so it's basically kind of got like your Western European language set is like one font you can get away with probably. Not most fonts, but you'll be able to find fonts without too big of a problem that support all of that. And then for like Arabic and like Turkish and other kinds of things with like very different glyph sets, you're probably gonna have to find a different font. And then for CJK, definitely a different font. Because CJK is like, that's always treated as kind of a separate case because you have to handle, 50,000 glyphs per language kind of a thing, right? Potentially. Of course, your game probably doesn't use every single character in each language, right? But you have to, so like that space is huge, but it's a different set of technical problems you have to deal with.
Yep. So that's a big consideration. And when it comes to fonts, the other thing is width. Yeah. Width of characters. So if you have a font that is fairly narrow, which we ran into this problem in Levelhead, and we did not make this mistake again with Crashlands 2, which is in Levelhead, the original font we chose for English that we were rendering in English is a very narrow font. It's very skinny. Well, CJK languages have square shaped characters. Like it's almost like monospace, where like each character takes up the same width, and they're wide, they're big.
But you typically need fewer of them, not always, but typically, versus the English version.
Right. And so, but what we ended up with was, in a lot of cases, we would have to change to a different font for a language. That font happened to be much wider, and sometimes we would end up with more characters on top of that, and we would have these weird interface overflow problems where, like, because the fonts were so dramatically different in width, that our interface is just kind of
this is basically the number one design issue with respect to with internationalization.
All your UIs are fucked.
They're all fucked. Yeah. You have to, if you're not planning from the very beginning to handle, because basically, as Seth is saying, you got your character width and like the square characters versus not, but you've also got German.
Oh my
German?
God. German.
What the fuck is going on over there?
I love it because they're like, it's like the long variable naming practice in code where it's like, we just want you to know exactly what this word is. And so they just you just explain a new thing by just tacking on additional other words to create
the problem with German is, have you guys heard like this parable of like the grains of rice on the chessboard thing?
No. Well, what's that?
It was like, the story is like some monk comes to this king and he's like, people in my village are starving. How about we get a chessboard and I'll put 1 grain of rice on the first square, and then we'll just double the grains of rice on each square, and then however much rice is there at the end, that's how much you'll give to my village. And the king is like, pfft.
The king's like, I don't understand exponential
He's like,
growth.
starting with 1 grain of rice, like, no problem. And of course,
how many could it be?
So by the time you get to the end, it's like more grains of rice than the weight of the earth or some shit like that, So this is the kind of like the problem that you run into with a lot of these like localization issues, is how like things kind of exponentially spiral out of control in terms of how many things you have to take into account. And so anyways, it's interfaces get crazy. Everything gets
so you
crazy.
just have to be careful about, you have to design, and this is why it's called internationalization. It's part of, and it should be, if you're going to do it, as early as possible.
Oh my God, yes.
As early as possible, because the longer you wait, and this is part of why this is typically so hard, kind of like porting, actually. It's the same kind of a problem. Yeah. Where typically people who aren't doing cross-platform development as like part of their thing, or who aren't internationalizing things as part of their thing, and often even when they are, they basically like make the game first, right? And then at the end, they're like, okay, how do we internationalize this, right? And that's also why like the concept of internationalization is like treated as a standalone thing. Often it's like, you've made your thing, now internationalize it, right? But if you're doing that, you're going to have a really, really bad, like Seth said, it took like more than half a year for us to get Crashlands, the original Crashlands, into Chinese. Not because it took that long to translate it. It takes a long time to translate stuff too, but we're talking weeks, for a good sized project, not 6 months, right? But it was because all of these things we're talking about, and many, many more things that we aren't talking about, related to making it so that you can have it look good and be understandable and be manageable on the developer side. We did it all at the end. We had to like redo so many things in the game.
Well, it's because when you're developing the game, you're thinking about these things one at a time, or sort of like sequentially, right? Which is like, okay, well, we just need a different font. All right, well, we just need to figure out a way to get the text out, blah, blah. But just like I was mentioning earlier, like these things aren't independent. They compound on each other. Like every decision that you make about how you're going to build your UIs, what fonts you're going to use, how you're going to format things, how much space there is, how you've programmed just even displaying words on the screen, like all these little things.
How you're handling word breaks, just everything.
Yeah, and if you didn't start in the right place, then you end up with just like a trillion problems, that you now have to figure out how to undo. So I'll talk about then like kind of the last bit. It's like, there is the font problems, missing characters. There's the UI space, like how do you fit stuff
planning,
in the UI?
Graphically for it to show up.
And the last bit is just like, what about the actual words? Like how do you set up your game so that you can show the proper words and swap them out?
How does the game know to say like, okay, you've toggled English or you toggled Polish or Chinese? How does it know where to get?
Yeah. And before we even get into like what we're doing, the first answer there is there isn't a way to do any of this, right?
Yeah. So the way that we do it is we use a lookup system. It's a key value pair, or you can think about it like in layman's terms, like a coat check, So when let's say we have like a button on the main menu that just says play game, right? So what you could do, and what we did, for example, in the original Crashlands, is we create that button in the game project, and then when I'm choosing what the button's going to display, I just type the words play game.
Hard coded, baby. Let's go.
Hard coded that onto that button, right? So that means that if we ever wanted to change that to localize it, we have to figure out how to make it so that the word play game on that button transforms into some other word from a different language. Well, we can't do that if it's hard coded, right? Mm-hmm. So what we do instead now is we create a token or like a little key, which
Little
is just
ID.
a little ID. So for example, instead of me typing play game and putting that on that button, I will go over to my localization text lookup system and I'll make a token that's called button_play_game, right? And then I'll say, all right, the English text for this is play game. That's the English text. So on the button, I say to the button, hey, go grab whatever text is associated with this token and show that. So go grab that. And then when you want to actually show translated text, then you just point to a different language.
Go grab collection. Whatever this button is in Chinese, and it's like, gotcha. I know.
Yeah. So we'll have a big pile of tokens under a Chinese section of our data. And here's all the Chinese words that are associated with those tokens.
Yeah,
and
so you look for the same,
ones.
so you look up the same ID, but just in the different language set.
Yeah.
And if you're thinking that sounds tedious as fuck when you originally could just type play game, and now you have to be like, oh god, I gotta go create an ID and like do all this other stuff. That's true. And that's also what it's just like, it's the same as like testing, right? There's a reason that people do a bad job at writing tests and stuff. And it's the same reason they do a bad job at solving these problems early is because it's a pain in the ass. It makes things that were easy hard. But
especially early in dev, right? When you're trying to iterate as quickly as possible to find some, like get to a point where you're like, this game is worth internationalizing, right? Because it's like you're not just going to necessarily be like, yeah, we're going to do it on this like game that no one even is interested in or whatever else. So you do have to make that decision at some point to start enforcing these practices and like ideally, like I said,
and it should be as early as possible.
And that means that for us, being a tooling first studio, that we try to make ways to make it not such a pain in the ass to.
Yeah. And that's exactly it, is that you need good processes and tooling as early as possible so that you can just start doing this kind of stuff because
your programmers aren't trying to kill you.
Yeah, because otherwise it's such a pain in the ass that people won't do it. And then the problem becomes now, 6 months down the line, you're like, okay, now we have a few thousand, pieces of text spread across this code base that we now need to go find and then do it all in like one huge horrible batch that nobody's happy, right? Because it's way better to add, because with all of these things, you're actually just trying to add a little bit of overhead all the time rather than fuckloads of horrible overhead later, right?
Well, there's a reason, getting back to what you're saying, which is that because if you, for example, do some test translations with a machine or something like that, with these early ones that you put in, you will find the ways in which your UI is broken already.
Yeah.
Which means that certain UI designs that your team is even thinking about for the next system that they're developing don't make any sense anymore, right? Like, and this is what we're talking about when we say this gets really into a really thorny and deep problem if you ignore it for too long, because you can ignore it and essentially think, oh, we'll just do, if it was the case that you could just do this programming part of it later in one big batch, you know what? Honestly, sure, whatever. Stops you from like slowing down so much on the iteration part. Sure. But the problem is it isn't isolated in there. Yeah. It spills onto the rest of the game
If you treat it as separate, you're going to make it the outcome worse and your life harder. But the other thing too about forcing yourself to deal with it when it comes up, right, is that if every time a string comes up, you have to think about localization. And by string, we mean the piece of text, right? That's the kind of
computer science term, programming term.
So every time a piece of text, if every time you're adding a piece of text to the game, you also have to think about how does this get localized, right?
Yeah.
Then
come up with a token, go create the token.
If you have to, on the one hand, it's kind of a pain in the ass, right? But on the other hand, that means that at the moment that you're putting that in, when you have full context, you're now having to interact with the internationalization sort of part of the thing, where you can now ask the questions like, okay, what are translators going to need to know about this? So that, and like, does this show up all the time? What kinds of things am I going to have to deal with when it's in other languages? It forces you to actually think about, in the moment you're using it, all the different downstream consequences of your choices there, right? And also allowing you to, if you have good tooling, to just add the context right in the data, right? That stores that thing that translators are going to need to know to be able to use this thing. Like, it's a play button. So you're like, this is a button. It's in this UI. Here's a picture of it even, or whatever, right? And it, like, you can look at what you're doing and be like, here's the width constraints, right? So you can try to tell translators like, I really need to figure it out. I really need to figure out how to force this to be less than 30 characters or whatever, which they can't always do, but
Yeah. And so this kind of comes then to the the next part of the issue, which is like, all right, so you got all the text in your token system. Once you've got it in there, meaning like it's in sort of like a lookup table or a database or whatever, however you've got it stored.
Dumb list.
It's a big pile of tokens and text that are all connected to each other. So at some point, you're going to have to get that to someone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, get it out.
What we've kind of discovered is that although there are standards among translators and localization teams and stuff, it's not that standardized.
Oh. The way that I would think about it is that translation teams are mostly not in-house. They're mostly third-party entities, right? And because they aren't part of the team putting the thing together, right? Then they actually, it's not that they don't have things that are like standards. It's that they have to adapt to whatever they get.
They got to deal with all the bullshit everyone else
does. So because game devs just kind of throw shit at them at random.
Yeah, so they try to support, so even though they have like some standardized file formats, for example, so the big one is called XLIF, XLIFF. But even though like that's what they want to support and their tools best support, they're like, also we'll take a CSV file, also we'll take a Microsoft Excel doc, also we'll take whatever.
Whatever you got, we'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out because we know that you don't know, developer, enough to give us what we need. So just give us what you have. We know you didn't put any fucking effort into this, right? Just give us what you have and we'll do our best from there, right?
Give us your 50,000 words from Crashlands in a spreadsheet, please.
Just sequentially, but not in any specifically understandable
random order.
Yep.
But just in a pile. Yeah.
And I think that's another note, which is when you're doing this lookup system, things that you would think about as like, these particular strings, these particular pieces of text should go in this order, or once they get pulled out, should be available in a particular sequence so that someone, I don't know, could like read the quest dialogue in the fucking order that it's given.
Yeah.
Not going to happen by default.
Not without a lot of consideration.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so this kind of gets us then to the next bit, which is, okay, so you've gotten the text exported from your game somehow into some file format. It's out there and you want to give it to translators. And this kind of comes back to what these guys were talking about at the beginning, which is like, this is not a book. They're not going to be able to just read through all of the text that you've given them and understand. Because, for example, if you just give them the word play, and in your mind you're like, yeah, that's the play button from the main menu, right? Well, play doesn't always mean play game.
Yeah.
In the sense of a button, it might mean just like to play, like how children play and like have fun, right?
It could refer to, you could have play with an exclamation mark, which you'd think obviously that means it's a like play on a play button, but it could just be an exclamation where someone's commanding you to play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's possible that like in English doesn't matter, just what same word, but in other languages it might matter a lot.
Might make a huge difference.
And if you don't speak those languages, you don't know that.
Yeah, which is the core problem on your side as the developer or the people that are trying to figure out how to assemble all the stuff for translation, is that there is no way for you to know. There just isn't what context is or which things need context, extra context, to be able to handle all of the target languages that you're dealing with. Because even if you're not just monolingual, like the three of us are,
you're not a 12-language polyglot.
You're
not
nobody's a 12-language polyglot who understands all the nuances of the language. It's just not a thing, right? And so you can't know. You just can't. And so your goal becomes, how do I just provide as much context as possible, right? Even because you can't guess when you actually need to.
Yeah. So this is where so we've talked about kind of like the core problems like, game devs will have with just like programming the game and getting it set up. Now, when it comes to this problem of providing context, providing additional information about things, as far as we understand, this is largely an unsolved problem in the sense that there is no real standard.
It's bespoke every time.
Yeah, there's no tool. There's no web service we can just sign up for. It's like Localization Buddy that you just make an account and you just give it all your strings and you can just provide all the information.
Well, I will say there are lots of tools that are like that, right? In the sense of like for handling various things related to translation, right? Because there's like some of the popular ones are for like crowdsourcing translations and all this kind of stuff, right? There are tools, right? But they're all trying to be like an all-in-one thing that actually isn't what translators want in like this kind of a scenario,
And oftentimes isn't what devs want either.
And also isn't what devs want. Yeah.
It's like a particular way of solving the problem from the outside that the people building the game or then translating the game typically can't quite fully make use of because it's not built by either of those people.
Yeah. But even if it was though, because you still got to figure out how do you, so say you've got an external tool to do that kind of stuff, right? Like annotating everything. Still, how do you know who's annotating it? How do they know what needs to go in there, right? What is the information? Who's responsible for it? You got to sort all that stuff out. And then you still have to answer the question is now, how do I get all of this information downstream to translators? Because if you're using like an all-in-one service kind of a thing, like, and these do exist, but usually they're not as good, right? I won't say always because I can't possibly know all of that, right? But like typically speaking, those are for getting you like really fast, just on the edge of acceptable translations, which are good for things like websites, right? But less good for things like a fictional universe and like it doesn't work as well in that context, right? Yeah. So you have that, but then how do the translators get access to it? So if you're using one of these like all-in-one sort of services, then that's the translators are using that same service. It's all part of the same deal, right? But again, those usually aren't for things like bespoke game translation, right?
Yeah.
So even if you could be like, well, I could just get login access, like pay for, now you like, I could be like, well, I need a few dozen translators for all the languages that we're covered because it's usually 2 or 3 people per language, et cetera. So you could be like, well, I could, pay to licensing fees because it's always like a per seat kind of a deal, right?
Give me 36
to get 50 people in here, right, to do it. But even if you do that, you actually can't because most of your translators are like covered by GDPR, covered by other kinds of stuff, handled by a project manager who's like trying to mediate all of this stuff, right? Who have their own tools,
their own internal systems because they got to track what's getting done.
And so, I think this is the thing that we have learned over time is that the problem that we need to solve is like we have to solve everything on our side in terms of like getting the things, annotating it, getting it ready to be sent, and then we have to figure out, given the situation, who's doing the translation, all that kind of stuff. Then we figure out how do we get it from our set of tooling now over to them for their system. But the idea of having like some kind of a service that either we make or that we pay for access to or whatever that handles all of it is not a thing. That's not a thing that exists. It's not, you don't get to do that. You basically have to be responsible for your side of preparing.
Yeah. There's no like drop down menu. Everyone jokes about this. And
no one
says, no one says, oh yeah, I added localization to my game in a weekend. No, you didn't. You really didn't. You might have added some shitty machine translation. You might have added your lookup system. Sure, you could do that, but
it's easy to add. It is easy to add machine translation. Like I spent about an hour and we had machine translatable stuff. We could just through Google Translate, right? But
which again we just used for testing interfaces and the existence of characters in our fonts, but those are not usable translations, right?
No, and in fact, if you give a machine translated version of a game to somebody, they will review bomb that shit so fast.
They'll know.
You were better off not doing it.
Unless you got no words,
So our solution to this problem with Levelhead was suboptimal, much better than Crashlands. With Levelhead, it was basically we just had like an extra text field that could come along with each string.
Yeah, so like while you're adding its ID, you could also then provide a description.
Yeah, so make a instead of it just saying like play, then it'd be a text like I would explain it. I would just type in, this is the text that appears on the play button on the main menu, right? Now, the thing is, they still don't know what the main menu looks like or how big the button is.
Wrap your head around that for a sec,
blah blah blah. Right. And so, so there was a lot of back and forth where very often they'd be like, do you have any screenshots of this? But like, we're actually just interacting with them over via a spreadsheet and stuff. So we're like emailing screenshots back and forth and it's
fucking nightmare.
And then like if one translator says, hey, can I have a screenshot? They get that screenshot, but we had 12 languages. So if 3 other translators are like, can I have a screenshot? They don't know that the first person got it. There's no way to see that. And so you just got to keep answering the same questions and solving the same problems, right?
Yeah.
So with Crashlands 2, our solution was to try to centralize this where we have a new backend web system that is creatively named the string server.
Yeah, it could use a better name, but
we'll probably come up with a name for it once it matures into its own kind of thing. But the idea is it's almost like a wiki, where essentially all of the text goes in there, and we can use it to audit the text, to attach screenshots, to have comment threads on specific things, to link text to other pieces of text so the translators can see, oh, this name of this creature is mentioned in these other places, and here's how people talk about it, or here's what it looks like, or
Context,
whatever.
context.
Or if one translator comes in, they're like, I don't know what this is. They leave a comment, and then, one of us replies, oh, here you go. And then we attach a screenshot or something. The next translator who comes in to look at that, they'll see that whole exchange. So they'll get all the context.
But it's it's still one of these like weird things, right? Where we're doing this so that we can keep on adding context. Basically, it's a database of strings and their context, right, with images and all kinds of stuff. It meant for on our side in particular to be collaborative. So we also wanted to. It's expensive to localize, and every time you change something, it has to be looked at again, right, by the localization team to see like did the meaning change, right, or was it just like a typo, right?
Right.
And so the cost of making changes keeps going up as you're doing all of this stuff. And so part of also so we're trying to solve a bunch of things at once, right? Is we want to make sure that before we send stuff off to get localized, that we are highly confident it's not going to change so that we can reduce our costs there, make sure we're sending off good stuff. And also make sure that somebody's looked at everything that's going to get sent off to ask, does this have sufficient context, right? So we want to be able to do that. We also, as we're generating this context in the first, or these strings in the first place via the quests and the stuff that's in the game, want to be able to easily check it for correctness, right? And make sure styles are consistent and stuff. And when almost every word you use is made up, it's pretty fucking hard to do, right? So that's part of what we're also doing with it is like we're building a glossary that we're using for spell check for ourselves, right, for the system, but that also we can send off to the translation team and be like, here's our glossary of all the words and what they mean, right? All of our weird made up words. So we can solve a whole bunch of problems at once. But at the end of all of that, we've got this really slick interface for doing all this stuff now, right? And translators are going to have access to it. From talking to that team, they're excited to have access to it. But the reality is still that most of what they'll be doing moment to moment is within their own tools, right? Mm-hmm. So the other thing that this thing has to do is make it so that it's really easy for us to like add all this information and then get them that in a format that they can basically update and re-upload into their own tools, right? And so we have like our own interface onto this thing via this web portal. And then basically just a download button that's accessible also via API so they can automatically do it, right? That just takes the current state of all of that and then writes it to a file format that is importable into their tools, which is that XLIF thing I mentioned.
And again,
right?
Their tools could be a variety of different tools.
Could be
so it depends on who you're working with.
Yeah. So we know with this... with this team, we know what the tool they're using. We're using one team, so they do everything really consistently in the same tool set, right? When we did Levelhead, they are actually using different tools. They tend to like have the same set of like they can use the same kinds of inputs and stuff, right? But it's not all the same. What translators are used to is not all going to be the same, and so a lot of what we had to do is just have fuckloads of back and forth with the team that we're working with to be like, what can I provide for you? Like, what do you need? What format should it be in? How do I make it possible for you to get this information, right? So that they don't have to come to our tool, because the moment that friction comes into play, they're going to be less likely to do it on the one hand, but also it just makes it harder to do their work, right?
Yeah. So you got to think about this from a DevOps perspective, where when we talk about DevOps, it's about work should be flowing in one direction. Right. So text should go from the game to our string server to the translators and then back to us and back into the game. That's the flow. If we send something to them and then they have to come back to us to figure out how it works, then that means things are flowing backwards through the pipeline, and we haven't done enough to make sure that they have what they need. Right. And so the tool is set up in such a way that whenever that happens, it'll be very obvious to us, and it'll also solve that problem in that space going forward. But it also allows us to pretty easily keep updating the tool to prevent backflow of stuff.
And with any new language, like you said, the difference between this and Levelhead's experience is that with any new language, you're not having a loss of context for new translators come in. So let's say the game comes out, does well, and we're like, oh, we do want to add a bunch of these other languages that are smaller, maybe, but we think it's important and we want to do it. You now have this really rich,
it'll be fast,
right? Of context that has already been used to establish the whole rest of the stuff. In other words, it's probably sufficient. So it's one of those things where you actually are able to collect all of the valuable feedback, even from translators directly, about individual strings, chunks of text, whatever, that would make it easier and easier to use over time. So it's not the sort of thing where it's just like, oh God. I mean, we talk about possibly adding a language to the original Crashlands, and the reality is like that whole thing is set up so, haphazardly because we coded it without even thinking about it originally, that it would also take a very fucking long time and a lot of work to put just another language in. We didn't solve it in a way that makes it possible for us to put a third language in.
There's zero
possible, but not really. It was actually because I was trying to, as I was collecting stuff for the Loc team, I also went, I was like, well, if they had, because also like they typically, if a good Loc team will want all of the information you can give them. They want all the context, all the lore, they want everything, right? And so since we do have the Chinese translation of the original Crashlands, like we want the Crashlands 2 to be consistently translated, since it's all the same characters and species and places and stuff, right? And so we also need them to use that. So I went to go track it down so I could provide that to them, And I went to the Crashlands, the original Crashlands repository, and I was like looking for it. I was like looking, but what I found was like 6 different files related to all of this, right? And for like different subsets of things that I was looking at, I was like, oh, these are like basically different stages of things, right? Because there was like a file that was basically the content for all the Rumpus stuff that got added way later, right? And another file that was for like these like really specific subsets of things, right? And then finally I found a file that like had everything in it, but it was only the translations. And so I was looking through this and I was like, where's the thing that's just like the English text and then the translation, right? And then it turned out that I was talking to Shure to find it, and then it's not even in the repo. There's actually this Google spreadsheet that has all of that in it.
Because the game exports that by developer command whenever you need it, but it doesn't like save it.
It's not in the project.
It's just like wherever you dumped it.
So it's like so it's if we wanted to add language to that, then it's like okay, well there's at least 3 different things going on, right? And there's like different files also per because we have different game modes. There's like, your regular story mode that has its set of text. And then there's like the creative mode that's a different set of text. And so like,
it's just a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. Right? Yeah.
And that's like, that's a place where we did actually solve it once, which is insane, right? It's like, it's a solved thing, but a nightmare to redo because it was.
It's always a nightmare, I think.
Well, this comes back to this, like one of the recurring themes that we've talked about over the years on the podcast is the phases of scalability. Right, which is like going from 0 to 1, meaning like you don't have anything at all, and then you've built a thing, right? Like that's your first big problem, and then being able to do that thing again, like the 1 to 2 jump, that's another big problem. Like we made that jump with Crashlands from having one language to having English and Chinese, right? But then
2 to many.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is there is no 2 to 3 jump. It's 2 to n, as in. Yeah. If you can do something 3 times, you should be able to do it 3,000 times without any consequence.
I think it's actually 2 to some, as in like and some depends on the context, right? It's like
because some moderately large number,
then there's a new number you reach where you're like now people would call it at scale, right? And because at scale means like there's a whole new set of kinds of problems that open up. Now you're like running out of memory on devices and all kinds of stuff, right? But you have these different layers though, and each one is basically just as hard as the last one to solve, right? Yeah. And you would think that if you solve one, you're closer to solving the next one, and often you are. But you're actually not always, because you'll often learn so many things that you just didn't know you had to think about when you go to that next jump that you discover, I'm building on a foundation that is really not made for this, which we've discovered over and over again.
So we kind of found in Levelhead, I'd say we solved the 2 to some problem in the sense that we were able to get 12 languages into the game.
We could have 12 more,
We could, but it was hard because we didn't have that middle layer of building up a library of knowledge about the text that the translators could use, which meant that every new language did require some amount of back and forth between us and the translator because they couldn't get all the information that they needed. So there's some amount of manual work that we have to do with every language.
And we weren't doing things that were well integrated with like how they actually do localization on their side. Everything for everybody was kind of mediated by spreadsheets, right? Which was not really
an important note there is that Levelhead is not a text heavy game in the sense of the text is not critically important.
It has 15,000 words.
It has 15,000 words. So that sounds like a lot, but in terms of requirement for you to just pick up the game and play, in other words, you're not playing Levelhead for the story is basically what I'm getting at, right?
It can survive a limited quality of translation and other kinds of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. But if you're talking about this is a long arc, you think about I don't know, Dragon Age or even Baldur's Gate or something, and it's you cannot get away with like really poor translation over a story-based game or something that has like quests that are supposed to make some fucking sense over time, right? Because stuff just starts getting weird. So, but I think at this point, though, we've talked about now how do you...
We should also actually say, for just real quick, for that idea of like the one to some and some to many and so on. When you're operating at sort of like AAA scale, or just if you're, as soon as you have audio in the mix, if you have like verbals, if you got voiceover stuff, you have a whole new set of problems that we're not going to get because we don't do it, but it's a new set of translation problems that we're unfamiliar with. Same kinds of problems, just a bigger nightmare yet even, right? But there's a new scale problem that gets introduced there, which is that what we're doing with our languages, like I said, we basically have a lookup table where it's just like we have every single string, every single ID for everything, and then we just have it repeated for every language with the version of it in that language, right? And that's just all loaded in the game at the same time. We just grab the right one, right? But if you are, Baldur's Gate and
millions of words,
50 gigabytes of VO or whatever, right? Then you have to decide, like, if we have this thing in 12 languages, which would have been a very intense ordeal to put together, right? But if we have it in...
There are individual characters in that game that have over 9 continuous hours of voice lines. Yeah. Like there's like one character whose voice lines played back to back is longer than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. Yeah. That's one character in that game. That's crazy.
It's wild. Yeah. So then you end up with a situation where now if you want to, because any given player only wants their language. They do not need other languages, right? If every single language that you have in your game basically contributes, say, 10 gigabytes of assets, right? Or if you're on mobile devices, then you're much more restricted. If even 100 megabytes is a lot, right? If you've got 12 languages, you're talking more than a gig, right?
Not because of storage, but because of RAM.
Because of RAM, right? And storage both, but yeah, right. So then you have to figure out, okay, now how do I load only the right language? So because we just load everything, which makes it really easy to deal with, in game. It's just all in memory at the same time. We just grab the right one. It also makes it easy to test because you can just switch languages dynamically. It's no big deal, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're now memory limited, then you have to figure out how do I actually load stuff from disk, right? Like while I'm doing stuff, whole new set of problems. And then if you're storage limited, then now you have to decide how do I distribute different versions of the game per language, right? And so like if you're looking at the back end of like Steam or Google Play or whatever, like any good third-party service, which really should be all of them, but any good one will have mechanisms by which you can basically have fully different versions of the game for different languages to solve this part of the problem.
Yeah. Right? So somebody doesn't need to download a petabyte of stuff just to play your game.
And so now you have this like this whole new set of build problems and distribution problems that where previously you were just making one thing and then uploading it somewhere. Yeah. Now you're making one per language and you have to deal with all the metadata, figure out, make sure stuff goes the right place. And this,
which also means if you want to compile that game and you got to compile 15 different versions of the game every time you make a patch. Yeah. And then you got to test those 15,
welcome to hell.
So again, it's the grains of rice thing. Like it doesn't like on its face. You're like, we just need to get some translations in there, right?
Just get the words, send them off to some
holy
translators.
Fuck. Nope. Yeah. Like the problems really compound.
And I think this brings us to the final piece, which is this. We talk about basically getting the text out of your game in the first place, providing it then with enough context and getting it over to your translation team, both in a format that they can appreciate and also in a format that isn't so dumb that you just have to redo work and it doesn't really save you time in the long run. So a context building format. Then let's say you get the translation back.
Yeah. How does it come back?
How do you get it back in?
How do you get it in? Yep.
And how do you know that like when you get it back in that while that whole translation was happening, because again, it takes weeks. While the whole translation was happening, new words got added, maybe some text got changed, right? And you get this first batch of translation back. How do you get that in there and then know what is done versus still needs tweaking?
Yeah. And now you're in the change management side, right? Which is now you have all this stuff, you got to pull it in. So that's its own set of problems, right? And then, like you're saying, you got to figure out, is everything covered or not, right? And there are lots of ways to handle all the different problems related to this. The sort of the non-nuanced one is the idea of string lock, right? And so you'll see this, especially in like AAA and stuff, where sometimes the scale of the problem is just so big that you're like, fuck it, right? And then your solution becomes...
Lock it down.
Yeah, your solution becomes basically the equivalent of we make a release branch of the game where nothing gets to change. Nothing, right? So that we can then say, all right, this game is baked. This is what it is. We're going to release whatever this turns out to be. You do your final testing on it. You do all that stuff, right? You make your builds, right? But you also, at that point, get all the strings pulled out, like do whatever process are to do that, send them off to localization. Don't allow them to change in the interim, import them in, and then that's the thing that you ship off, right?
And to be fair, that is a way to do it. It also sucks for, just everyone involved, because what you're dealing with there is then you have these string lock moments, which typically are going to be months before the game is being truly like deployed for its finished state, right?
Yeah, for a little bit of like time context, we're starting our first round of Loc for Crashlands 2 next week with about 50,000 words so far. It's about a third of the game.
Which is also the size of the first game, by the way. I think
which is the size of the first
54,000 words. Yeah,
something like that. And they're expecting something like 3 to 4 weeks to do the translations plus Loc QA, which is specialized quality assurance to test localization, right? So for basically like a novella length of stuff, it's going to take about a month, right, for us to get that result back. And that's not even accounting our own testing and stuff that we have to do on the other side of that, and blah, 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 right? So that's your kind of delay you're working with. Like you've got a version of the game you think is ready. You got your strings. Now you wait a month.
Yep.
There's nothing going to change in that time. That's not really how stuff works.
Or like what if people find stuff, or, we were doing some testing on the game, some play testing, or we're putting a demo out or something. We got some feedback. We need to adjust the intro of how this goes to make the whole thing better. And you imagine a producer being like, no. Or you can, but it won't be in the build that actually gets released to the public when the game comes out.
And even smaller stuff you might not even think about, right? Like so we're working on this stuff, and we want to have a build of the game we can use to send off for marketing and various kinds of purposes.
Demos.
Right? And ideally, it's got an up-to-date credits page in it, because it's the moment we're actually shipping the game. Like I really want to be able to give people credit, But that means we have to have a localized credits page. But we don't even know who the translators are yet, right? Because they haven't translated it, right? So we'll discover that while they're translating. That's when we'll find all that stuff out, right? Once the process is started, basically, right? So you don't need to localize people's names, but you do need to localize their roles, right? And
their titles or whatever.
And so this is one of those things too. It's like you don't want to be stuck in that situation where you're like, oh shit, we can't actually start, or even like Seth's working on some difficulty modes, right? But that's not done yet, so there's going to be some new everything. Time you do anything, it adds new text.
We're kind of predicting. So, this is kind of like the real problem we have is we've actually set up our production in a way that's weirdly antithetical to the pacing of localization. Where like a lot of games will slow down their content production at the end and instead focus on polish and QA.
Yeah.
We do polish and QA continuously, so that by the time we near the end of development, our rate of content production exponentially ramps up week over week. So the problem now is we're predicting that we're going to be adding roughly 400 strings per week to the game. And a string could be a word or a paragraph or what, like text.
Yep.
But so we're predicting, roughly 400 strings per week on average over the next 6 months. And so even if we, send it to translators right now, by the time they get back to us, there's going to be a whole nother batch, and then another batch, and another batch, another batch. And so that's, kind of the next problem we've got to figure out how to solve with them, because they're going to be less accustomed to this kind of a way of operating with an ever accelerating rate of things coming through the pipe.
And for practical purposes, because they got to schedule stuff, they have their own shit to deal with, right?
Yep.
So that means that practically speaking, it's got to be done in batches, right?
You got to pick your batch size.
So you got to pick your batch size and try to, and basically, so what we'll be doing on our side is basically we get to enough strings that we're like, all right, it's big enough that it's worth deploying all the resources required to organize and do a batch, right? And then while that batch is being done, we're going to continue to dump stuff into it, right, as it goes. And then once they hit a point where they've basically finished / they've got to the point where they're like, well, we hit the end of that timeline because new stuff just keeps coming in, right? So we'll call it done. We'll get that thing, because we're now going to live in a state where we're just always have a partial translation, right?
Yes.
And before launch, we will have to, at some point, go into actual string lock. That will have to happen, because you have to stop doing it so you can deploy a game that has everything translated in it, right? So you still have to eventually, but during active development, that's when this stuff is really hard, because if you wait until the very end to do all of your localization, then now you're taking what would have been in this case, a month to do the first third. The next thirds will each be a little easier because so much of the initial work is building the glossary and figuring out how stuff works and blah, 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 right? But we're talking a total of something like 3 months of localization time for a game the scale of Crashlands 2, right? If we put that all at the end, that means we had to know literally everything that was in there, have it all locked
3 months in advance.
and then have a 3-month window where that was all true and we got the localization done, right? With no room for like, well, what if we want to make changes, like, right? And then we're now just waiting,
Yeah. Well, the other thing that we don't know, because we haven't worked with this translation company before, and the timelines that they're giving us are based on their past experience from translating hundreds of other games, right?
Yeah.
What we don't know is, will it be faster for us because of the tooling we've developed? Like, will they be able to translate this more efficiently and quickly than than other things they've done, because they can just blaze right through it without having to be confused the whole time about what it is that they're looking at?
And less rework and stuff, because a lot of it too is like we're talking about all that uncertainty you have. Right, it's like a play button. What does it actually mean, right? Because the Loc team also, like, they don't want to be peppering the developer with infinite questions, right? And so they're going to make their best guess most of the time, and they're kind of operating the same way that we are, where we're trying to guess the level of uncertainty about like stuff, right? And so if they're like a little unsure but feel pretty confident, they're not going to ask, right? And so if there wasn't context that definitely made it unambiguous, then you just now have this kind of constant low level error rate where, because the cost of asking is high, then they're just going to translate instead, right? And now way more cost and time has to go into Loc QA to discover all the things where stuff ended up being translated in a funny way because there was context.
They did originally budget for 10 times the amount that we ended up telling them we needed.
I think even more, actually. Yeah.
When
we put an estimate together from them, and they said they gave me the number for how many QA hours they wanted to put in, and I was like,
literally no.
This is a lot. This is way too many.
I think we actually cut it down by 99%.
Yeah, it was
in terms of because again they're assuming that they're not going to get any support from us as developers when it comes to them being able to investigate the game and verify that their translations are displaying as intended and working well, right?
Which is then another part of the puzzle, right? Is that you need to be able to, because what we need to be able to do is provide basically like a guide to how to test the localized versions. Because we can test the technical parts of it, like does stuff fit in the boxes, that kind of thing, right? Are the glyphs there? But we can't test, does it translate it correctly? Like, do the buttons now make sense, right? And so what we need to be able to do is have a good enough QA team, good enough developers that they can assemble basically like an instruction manual for how to do the Loc QA test, how to move through the game to cover as quickly as possible all the things that we think need to be covered. And we have to know ahead of time, like which things we can be confident of, that if this is good, that implies that all this other stuff is good enough too, probably. So we don't need to actually explicitly test it, right? And that's just another thing we have to do is figure out like, what is that? How do we design that so that now when we give that to Loc QA, now it can take them a day instead of 3 months or whatever, right? To actually do all that work. So it's a lot.
Yep.
Yeah. So as you can see, we got a lot more to say about it, but we're out of time.
Let's cover the basics.
This is a big problem. And I hope it kind of sheds some light on like the evolution that we've experienced as a studio, like with our first games, just English. Crashlands launch was just English, and it took a lot of time and mistakes and learning and all that just to get Chinese into the original Crashlands. Yep. And we still just can't get other languages into it without like probably another 8 months of work, right?
Yeah. The problem we have left still is right to left languages, which we haven't.
Yeah, we have not yet.
Don't even crack that nut. I don't want.
That's one of those like we've now solved
so much pain.
So much. Yeah, we solved so much stuff, and we know like that's the one blind spot we have left. Everything else right now is designed to make it workable for all the languages that we've supported, right? And CJK was the big hard one at that time, right? Because it introduces new kinds of problems versus like all the different Western European languages. But then right to left introduces a brand new set of problems, wholly new technical problems, and design problems. Because now the question is, how do you make it look right when things are now right to left, right? And we don't know is the short of it. Yep. We haven't solved that, and it's one of those like.
And honestly, we won't solve it in Crashlands 2.
We don't. Yeah,
we have so many other problems. We have so many other problems to solve, and we're always trying to move the needle. We're trying to move things forward in a way that we can afford, that still keeps us on a good timetable. It's not that we don't care. You know, we do want people to be able to play Crashlands 2 in Arabic. That'd be fucking awesome.
That'd be dope.
And we want people from that part of the world to be able to experience the things that we're making. You know, we want to be able to interact with players and fans over there. Like, that'd be awesome. But the technical problems that we have to solve are huge, and we can only solve so many of them. And we've got to just pick some problems to solve, get those done, and then hopefully with the next game, you know, we can.
Yeah, and that's that idea earlier we talked about. It's that idea of that investment choice, right? Which is like, yeah, it is true that if you can invest in access to more markets, that's generally a good move, right? However, like as the market sizes of those markets, as each one shrinks and changes and whatever, and your ability to actually intentionally, you know, market in that space and that kind of stuff goes down, the value proposition also keeps going down. Which if the investment required goes up, yeah, exactly.
As I think we've made clear, like actually, this is what always blows my mind because when you get, I just hope that it's the case when players hear this in particular, not devs, but even just players, where it's like, if you've ever wanted a game to be in your language and it's not.
This is why it's not.
This is why it is so fucking hard. It is insanely hard, and it
Which
does
is not
so
to
many
say
things.
It shouldn't be, right? Because we all want, honestly, there's no developer, I think, in the fucking universe except for probably really racist ones or something, who don't want their game in like every language. Because it's awesome. It's awesome to have players all over the world. It's so cool when somebody writes in a support ticket and you're like, I don't know what this says because it's not my language, right? Yep. And then like now we're going to Google Translate trying to figure out how do I communicate with this person who's playing this, who's engaging with this thing that I made, right? Mm-hmm. It's fucking cool. And I remember like when we first got OG Crashlands into Chinese, I remember we got it like loaded up and we had like Sam made like a custom title in the Chinese title. You know,
we had
like,
a voice
loading
actor
that up.
redid the trailer with a Chinese voice actor,
which was
hilarious. Yeah.
Awesome. And like and like the trailer and then booting up the game and like actually like looking at it and seeing all the Chinese text come up was one of the coolest dev experiences. I think
it was weirdly emotional.
Was so
like,
cool.
Like seeing the entire main menu, splash screen, everything completely in Chinese. Yeah. It was just like it felt like a milestone. Cool.
Yeah, you know? So I would love to someday be able to be like, yeah, we'll just basically support everything, you know. But you can't. There's a jillion languages, right? But being able to make it just like more and more possible to have to solve more of these problems is one of those things that I think it's cool that we get to do. But if you're already at a point where like you don't have the cash, you don't have the time, you don't have right. There's only so much new investment. That's the other thing. There's only so much new investment you can do each time before you're starting to create new risks of not even being around.
But there's one thing you can do, which is, you know, even if it's like the position we were in when we first made the first Crashlands was we didn't have the money to do it.
We couldn't pay for translation.
Yeah, but the thing is, had we been thinking about it, I could have set up the game's UIs to be able to easily swap out translated.
We could have still prepared.
So that way, if the game did well, then we could have figured that out and had multiple translations for a bunch of languages in, you know, under 8 months, instead of one sort of like locked in Chinese translation and then no ability to do anything else, right? Yeah. So like we could have done it in a way that set us up to be able to make the investment.
Yes. And I think that's the recommendation. I think at the end of this is
take the low cost setup thing so that if you hit a point where it's possible for you, you get publisher money, maybe you get a deal going, or you even launch the game and it does well, that you can turn around and finish the rest of it, right?
Yeah, and that's that internationalization bit. Yeah, so do some reading on it. Like, and it's like so fascinating actually, like stuff that you just don't think, like the fact that different languages have like gendered nouns and stuff, right? Or an absence of gendered pronouns, right? And like they're all there's like stuff that you don't think is going to matter or be even a thing to consider, or different kinds of plurals, right? Because like it's one of the most fascinating things that I had to like kind of figure out is like how do you deal with if you need to like inject a number into something and then need the text to adapt to that fact, right? That different languages have different cutoffs for, because we have like 0 is we treat as a plural, and then 1 is a singular, and then everything else is a plural in English, right? And in other languages, you have like a distinct thing for 0, a distinct thing for 1, and then like a sum that goes between a certain set of numbers, and then like a many, right? Yep. And each language has a different like way of doing things at different levels, just for something like numbers, right? And so you don't, so even something that you just think, oh, I just need like a plural form and a singular form. That's not fucking true, actually. Right.
Yeah.
And you might be thinking like, why would you need that many? Well, why do we even need singular and plural? If I say, hey, I have 3 apple, you understand what
get
that
it.
means. Yeah. Why do I need to slap an S on the end of that thing?
That's just how we do it.
That's just how we do it in English. I don't know.
And all languages are like that. Only they just do it in a different way. And so
They just do it differently.
It is one of the cool things about this stuff. And it's worth, if you're making a thing and you hope someday, to have it be localized, start very early, just reading about this stuff. Just learn about it. Go play around with like what it means to translate stuff, the kinds of tools people use, and just learn about it. Cause it'll make you a better developer. You'll just learn new things about how you might do things in the future to support multiple languages and stuff.
Dare I say, it'll make you a better person.
Yeah.
You'll become a citizen of the world. You'll start to appreciate other cultures more. Only good things come from this. Expensive as it may be.
It's expensive.
All right. Well, this was a little bit of a different episode than we normally do. A little bit of a deep dive into something pretty interesting that we're kind of working on. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. And that's all the time we have for this week. We'd like to thank our producers, Fat Bard and Sampa DaCosta, for putting the podcast together. And thanks to our community moderators who keep our Discord running. To get more involved in the Butterscotch community, just go to podcast.bscotch.net, where we have links to the community Discord, a way for you to donate, and links to the podcast archives. And as always, if you haven't yet, head on over to Steam and give Crashlands 2 a wish list. It'll help boost its visibility in the store, which of course helps us out a ton as we get closer to launch. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.